In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Cold War entered its most dangerous phase. The fragile, uneasy peace of détente had shattered, replaced by a renewed, technologically driven arms race. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in a paranoid struggle, defined not by open conflict, but by shadows, secrets, and the relentless pursuit of a decisive strategic advantage. At the heart of this struggle was a desperate, urgent need for security, a search for a guarantee against the unthinkable, a nuclear first strike that could paralyze a nation before it had time to retaliate. For the Soviet leadership in the Kremlin, this fear was not abstract. It was specific, immediate, and it was aimed directly at their heads. This existential terror, born from a new generation of American engineering, would lead Soviet engineers to an equally radical, terrifying, and secret solution. They were ordered to solve an impossible problem. How does a nation fight back after its government, its military command, and its leaders have already been vaporized? Their answer was Systema Perimetr, a semi-autonomous, automated command system, hardwired logic and sensors, not a thinking machine, designed to unleash the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal on the world after its masters were dead. When its existence was finally revealed, the world was shocked to learn that the concept of a Doomsday Machine from Dr. Strangelove was not entirely fiction. It wasn't science fiction, but it followed the same cold logic, a doomsday mechanism built to guarantee retaliation. This is the story of that machine, the ghost in the wires, the terrifying engineering brief that created it, and the cold, brutal logic of automated annihilation. The genesis of the Soviet Union's automated nuclear retaliation system, known in the West as Dead Hand, was not an act of naked aggression. It was a calculated, defensive response to a profound, existential terror. To understand the cold, terrifying logic of its engineering, one must first understand the strategic nightmare that gripped the Kremlin in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The system, officially designated Perimetr, was a machine born from the acute, visceral fear of total annihilation, the fear of a single paralyzing blow known as decapitation. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers lived under the constant shadow of a potential nuclear first strike. But for the Soviet leadership, this generalized fear coalesced into a specific, acute, and technologically driven crisis with NATO's dual-track decision of 1979. This decision authorized the deployment of a new generation of American intermediate-range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs, in Western Europe, primarily in West Germany. The centerpiece of this deployment was the MGM-31 Pershing II, a weapon that, from the Soviet perspective, fundamentally and terrifyingly altered the nuclear balance. It did not just add more missiles to the board. It introduced a new category of threat, one that threatened the very foundation of their deterrent strategy and their physical survival. The terror inspired by the Pershing II stemmed from a revolutionary combination of three engineering capabilities: speed, accuracy, and perceived lethality. First, and most critically, was speed. Unlike intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, which traveled from launch silos in the continental United States to the USSR in approximately 30 minutes, the Pershing II, launched from West Germany, could reach key targets in the Western Soviet Union, including the command bunkers in Moscow, in as little as 6 to 8 minutes. Some paranoid Soviet estimates
placed the flight time at under 5 minutes. This unprecedented velocity created a compressed time window that was shorter than the Soviet Union's entire human decision-making process. Second, this incredible speed was coupled with devastating accuracy. The Pershing II was a marvel of 1980s engineering, equipped with an advanced terminal guidance system. As the warhead re-entered the atmosphere, an active radar seeker in its nose cone would switch on, seeing its target and correcting its own course. This gave the missile a circular error probable of just 30 meters. Third, compounding this fear was the Soviet belief that the Pershing II was intended to be a bunker buster. They fixated on the W-86, a specialized Earth-penetrating warhead designed for that exact purpose. In reality, the W-86 Earth penetrator was canceled around 1980, and the Pershing II deployed with the standard W-85. But this distinction was lost in the paranoia of Moscow. What they saw was a weapon that was fast, radar-guided, and accurate enough to terrify them. A scalpel, precision-engineered to destroy the deep underground command and control bunkers that housed the Soviet political and military leadership. As one former Soviet general recalled, the leadership was convinced the Pershing II was not a theater weapon, but a first-strike weapon designed for one purpose: to kill the leadership in their bunkers. All planning had to assume this worst-case scenario. This technological threat was dangerously amplified by the geopolitical climate. The hyper-realistic 1983 NATO command post exercise, known as Able Archer 83, created a hair-trigger atmosphere in Moscow. The KGB initiated Operation RYAN, a massive global intelligence effort to detect any sign of a surprise Western nuclear attack. This paranoia reached the very top. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev was visibly terrified, and his hand trembled before he symbolically pushed the mock-up of the launch button. The fear was not abstract. It was visceral, personal, and pervasive. It was this atmosphere of profound and sustained terror that formed the psychological bedrock upon which the engineering brief for Perimetr was built. The terrifying threat posed by the Pershing II missile was magnified by a critical systemic weakness in the Soviet Union's nuclear command architecture, its extreme centralization. Rooted deeply in the rigid top-down political structure, the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons was held exclusively by a tiny handful of political leaders in Moscow, engineered to prevent an unauthorized launch by a rogue general. In the face of a weapon like the Pershing II, however, this institutional strength became a catastrophic vulnerability. A successful decapitation strike that eliminated the General Secretary, the Minister of Defense, and the Chief of the General Staff within their Moscow bunkers would effectively sever the head of the Soviet nuclear forces from its powerful body. This centralization was their Achilles heel. The authority to launch was held by a few men in Moscow, linked by a complex command network. While this prevented a rogue general from starting a war, it also meant a single 6-minute strike on the leadership would paralyze the entire arsenal. The Soviet Union would die in silence. This structural vulnerability was exacerbated by a significant technological gap. Their critical early warning systems were notoriously unreliable and prone to terrifying false alarms. The most famous and terrifying example occurred on September 26, 1983. The Soviet Oko satellite network suddenly reported the launch of 5 American Minuteman ICBMs. In a hardened bunker outside Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer. His screen flashed, "Launch." But Petrov hesitated. He was an engineer, and he knew the system's flaws. He also knew his ground radar network showed no corresponding targets. Trusting his gut, he made the monumental, world-saving decision to report the alert as a system malfunction. As Petrov later stated, when people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. It just didn't make sense. He was right. The system had mistaken the glint of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the engine plumes of 5 missiles. Stanislav Petrov's logical defiance had saved the world. But the incident proved how fragile their early warning systems could be, a lesson that reinforced the need for a more foolproof backup. This created the ultimate dilemma. They could not trust their computers. This forced them into a launch under attack doctrine. But the Pershing II's 8-minute flight time meant that by the time they had that confirmation, their leadership would already be gone. They were trapped. This combination of rigid centralization and unreliable warning technology created the unsolvable engineering problem that Perimetr was conceived to overcome.
The acute fear of decapitation in the mid-1970s demanded a far more radical solution. Soviet technical histories trace its origin to a top-secret 1974 government order delivered to one of the crown jewels of the Soviet military-industrial complex, the Yuzhnoye Design Bureau in the closed city of Dnepropetrovsk, Ukraine. The engineering brief given to the designers at Yuzhnoye was as simple as it was horrifying. This order assigned Yuzhnoye to build a backup launch system, the project that became Perimetr. They were tasked to create a highly automated, redundant backup command system that could guarantee the transmission of launch orders under a single, unthinkable condition: that the primary command system and the entire political leadership of the Soviet Union had been annihilated and silenced. The mandate was, in effect, to solve for the variable of their own deaths. They were to build a ghost. They were to engineer a machine that could execute the final will and testament of a dead nation. This was the birth of Systema Perimetr. Perimetr is the ultimate expression of this paradox, a machine built to uphold the state's ultimate power, the power to retaliate, by operating on the absolute, verified certainty of the state's utter destruction. The Perimetr system is a masterpiece of cold, brutalist, and redundant engineering. It was not an AI with malevolent consciousness. It was designed as a complex, multi-layered, and deeply logical system built to answer 2 fundamental questions in an unchangeable sequence. First, is the nation under a massive, undeniable nuclear attack? And second, is there anyone left alive in command to respond? Only by receiving an unequivocal yes to the first question and a definitive no to the second would the machine be authorized to proceed. Phase 1. The Awakening and the Symphony of Sensors. The system was engineered to lie in a semi-dormant, passive state. It would be awakened only during a period of extreme international crisis. This activation was not automated. It was a deliberate manual command from a high-ranking official. This human decision was the first and last point of human agency in the chain. Once activated, the system's first task was to determine with near-perfect certainty if a nuclear war had actually begun. To eliminate the possibility of a catastrophic false alarm like the 1983 Petrov incident, Perimetr's engineers used sensor fusion, a network of thousands of autonomous physical sensors looking for the undeniable signatures of nuclear war: the seismic shock, the pulse of radiation, the flash of light, and the spike in atmospheric pressure. Only if this symphony of destruction was heard from multiple locations would the system proceed.
Phase 2. The logic of the void. Even after Perimetr's sensor network confirmed that the homeland was being consumed by nuclear fire, it did not immediately initiate a retaliatory strike. It proceeded to its second and most ghoulish logical check. It had to confirm that the human chain of command was broken. The system would begin to actively monitor military communication networks, checking for a heartbeat from the human command structure. If communications were still active, it meant that leaders were alive. The system would immediately stand down. The final, irreversible decision to transfer launch authority from man to machine was based on a simple, terrifyingly elegant two-factor algorithm. If the sensor network confirms that a widespread nuclear attack is occurring, and if all communication links with the general staff are severed and remain silent, the system is programmed to conclude that a successful decapitation strike has occurred. It is at this moment that Perimetr is authorized to initiate the final retaliatory protocol entirely on its own. This two-key logic is what defined Perimetr's genius. Perimetr offered a third unique option. The leader could activate the system and then do nothing. He could wait. This single act provided a backstop, a guarantee that a full-scale retaliation would occur even if he were wiped out. This human buffer bought him the most precious commodity in a nuclear crisis. It gave him the ability to ride out the attack, knowing that his nation's vengeance was assured. As one of the Perimetr developers, Vladimir Yarinich, later explained, the system was designed to cool down all these hotheads and extremists by removing the incentive for a hasty, hair-trigger response. Phase 3. The Voice of Vengeance. Once Perimetr's central processor had confirmed both the attack and the silence of its masters, it faced its final engineering challenge: how to deliver a single authenticated launch command in a post-apocalyptic environment saturated with electromagnetic pulse. They put the command post on top of a rocket. The core of this phase was the command missile, identified in technical histories as the 15P011, a specially modified UR-100N ICBM known to NATO as the SS-17 Spanker. But instead of a thermonuclear warhead, it carried a unique payload, the 15B-99 command module. This 1,400-kilogram module was not a weapon of destruction, but of communication, a complex, hardened package containing a powerful, high-frequency radio transmitter. Upon receiving the final automated go-ahead, these command missiles would blast off from their silos. During their flight, the 15B-99 transmitter was meant to broadcast a continuous, repeating, and heavily encrypted message, the authorization codes, and the final, irrevocable command to launch. Phase 4. The Final Command. The final piece was the network of receivers. The entire Soviet nuclear triad had been retrofitted with special dormant radio receivers. These receivers were engineered for a single purpose: to listen silently for the unique, authenticated, encrypted transmission from the 15B-99 command rocket. They were waiting, in total silence, for one specific voice to call out from the post-apocalyptic wilderness. Once a valid launch command was received, the launch sequence could initiate fully and automatically. Lids on thousands of hardened silos would blast open. The entirety of the Soviet Union's remaining nuclear arsenal would be unleashed upon its pre-programmed targets. This was the system's final convulsive act, a posthumous, nationwide spasm of retaliation orchestrated by a ghost in the machine.
The Perimetr system was more than just a complex piece of hardware. It was a profound, chilling statement about the nature of deterrence and the psychology of its creators. Years before Perimeter became operational, its core, terrifying concept was introduced to the world in Stanley Kubrick's 1964 satirical masterpiece, Dr. Strangelove. The plot of the film hinges on the revelation that the Soviet Union has secretly built a Doomsday Machine. When the existence of Perimeter was finally revealed to the West in the 1990s, the parallels were as undeniable as they were chilling. Both the real Perimeter and the fictional Doomsday Machine were designed as the ultimate deterrent. Both followed the same logic, a doomsday mechanism built to guarantee retaliation. The most stunning and strategically significant parallel, however, lies in the shared fatal flaw of secrecy. In the film's climax, the Soviet ambassador reveals the existence of the Doomsday Machine only after the detonation is inevitable. In an almost unbelievable case of life imitating art, the Soviet Union made the exact same strategic blunder. Perimeter was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire Cold War. This simple fact carries a profound strategic implication. Its secrecy blunted its deterrent power abroad. Because the United States did not know that a successful decapitation strike would trigger an automated all-out retaliation, the system could not fully function as a deterrent against such a strike. But it reassured Soviet leaders at home that no strike would go unanswered. This leads to a startling, counterintuitive conclusion. Its primary functional effect during the Cold War was not on Washington's calculus, but on Moscow's. It acted as a psychological brake on the Soviet military's own hair-trigger impulses, an insurance policy against their own unreliable technology. The Soviets built the world's most terrifying weapon, kept it a secret, and its only real-world effect was to make themselves less likely to accidentally start a nuclear war.
The fall of the Berlin Wall and the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not relegate the dead hand to the history books. The existence of Perimeter was not exposed through a single dramatic act. In these interviews, officials like Colonel General Vartholomei Korbushin and Vitaly Karayev began to openly acknowledge that the system was real. They described a mechanism that could be manually activated during a crisis and would then automatically launch all missiles if it detected a nuclear strike and a simultaneous loss of command. The Doomsday Machine was a fact. But the most chilling part of Perimeter's story is not its past, but its present. The system was never decommissioned. The Russian Federation inherited its entire nuclear arsenal. After 1991, Russian officials hinted the system endured. In 2011, Colonel General Sergei Karakayev, the commander of Russia's strategic rocket forces, stated publicly that an automated retaliation system was still functioning and on alert. This was not a nostalgic admission about a Cold War relic. It was a modern strategic declaration. Russian engineers have almost certainly upgraded the 1970s-era computers. The system is modernized, still watching, still waiting, and ready to execute its final automated command. The logic that created Perimeter has also been modernized. Russia now points to the development of U.S. prompt global strike technologies, advanced hypersonic missiles, as new existential dangers. This renewed vulnerability creates a powerful, continuing incentive to rely on the cold, automated logic of an upgraded perimeter. The story of Systema Perimetr is the ultimate engineering horror story. It is a tale of how rational, brilliant engineers, when given an impossible and terrifying problem, solved it with perfect, terrifying, and inhuman logic. They were tasked to build a machine that could think, sense, and act in a world where its creators no longer existed. They succeeded. They engineered a ghost, A technological specter forged from seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and binary code. It is a machine that embodies the final paranoid paradox of the nuclear age, the belief that the only way to ensure humanity's survival is to build a machine that guarantees its total destruction. The Dead Hand was, and remains, a testament to the fact that the greatest horrors are not supernatural. They are the logical, calculated, and engineered solutions that we build ourselves. The horror of Perimetr is not just that it was built, but that it is still on duty, listening, waiting, and ready to execute its final automated command. A silent ghost guarding the end of the world.